Greetings, and welcome to Beatles Stuffology, where two old friends sit around and talk BS, Beatles stuff, on a track-by-track basis, pretty much for the sake of it. My name is McQuarrie, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrew Deacon. Say hi, Andrew.
Hello. I'm going to introduce you to an interesting little phrase today that I've read in relation to the song that we're going to talk about, or at least something to do with the song, bowel rumbling brilliance. Okay, there's a little feed forward for you folks. Bowel rumbling brilliance.
Fantastic. Well, we're in for some exciting times this episode then. We said
Yes.
that, but we're talking about every little thing. So, yeah, we're getting through the second side now. Oh, yeah, don't forget the timpani. That's very important. We will be discussing timpani.
Well, you have to, after every time you say every little thing,
Dum-dum.
you have to do that.
Okay.
That's just the way it works.
Lovely. Okay, so what did you think of this song?
Okay, so I have views. I think it is potentially a brilliant song. I think it's merely pretty good, pretty darn good. But I think that's primarily because although apparently it was written by Paul, you see the rhythm there, that's quite good, you know, boom, boom. Anyway, never mind, someone would have got that. It was written by him with the intention of it being a possible single. By the time they came to record it, it was clear it wasn't going to be a single, and as a result, perhaps they didn't spend as much time in the studio finessing and polishing it in a way that they would have done for something that was going to be a standalone release. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that it could have been so much more. So to me, it's merely a very good album track that lifts the mood between some fairly slight covers, and I would then put it in the same bracket as a song like You Can't Do That.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's very much one of those sort of, well, I was going to say forgotten gems. I think that's maybe a little bit too much, but it's definitely one of the sort of forgotten tracks. McQuarrie doesn't seem to have much regard for it, doesn't seem to have really done anything with it since it was recorded. And it's one of those songs that I think, like, if you explain it, you go, oh, right, yes, it's that one. But it's kind of quite difficult to get it to stick in the mind otherwise. And I think that kind of leans into what you're saying, which is it really could have been outstanding. But as it is, it's simply extremely good. It's definitely one of the highlights of side 2 of this record. Not that there are a lot of highlights to pick out. But it gives a bit of tonal variety to what's going on in the album. And I really like that kind of side of it as well. I know one of the things that a lot of people say about this song is that it feels like it's kind of prefiguring what's going to happen on Help and Rubber Soul, and I get that to an extent, but it's not really like anything which is on either of those albums. It's too short apart from anything else. It's only 2 minutes long.
I think that's reading a bit too much into it.
I think so.
I think it's fair enough. After the fact, you can maybe draw some sort of subliminal comparison, but you know that would be like I've not seen the McCartney lyric book, but that would be like McCartney writing a 3,000 word essay on the subtext of why don't we do it in the road, and you know there is no subtext. You know, it's you know after the fact, and you know it's fine if people want to make those associations, they can do so. It's really not a problem. I think it's interesting you say, because I think the interesting things about the song are the instruments, the instrumentation, and we're not talking about the guitars, we're not talking about the bass, we're not really talking about those drums, but we are talking about the timpani and the piano as well. And I suppose in that sense we could be prefiguring what's to come because of the difference in instrumentation that the Beatles start to develop from this point onwards. Stops talking in that voice, because actually those bits are more interesting than the lyrics, which are pretty bland.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I realised I said something to you off mic before we started recording that I was going to do, and I haven't done it, so I'm going to do it now, a mere 5 minutes into the episode, which is say,
Hurrah.
there might be quite a lot of swearing coming up. So I just want to make people aware. For those of a more sensitive disposition, we do swear from time to time on this podcast, but there's going to be a fair bit of it coming up, and it's all entirely justified. So I just want to make that point very clear.
Sits back, put feet up, lights cigar, and waits for the action.
Excellent. Well, it's not coming up just yet, so I don't want to blow my load too soon. But it's definitely coming up nonetheless. I probably could have found a better way of saying that. Never mind.
As we've just mentioned the instrumentation, perhaps I'll bring in my reference to the bowel rumbling brilliance.
I think you should.
There was an article a few years ago, 2009, in The Guardian about the timpani, called What's That Sound, which there's a nice sort of 60s link there. And it's actually in that article that I don't think it's the writer. I think it's probably the sub-editor who's added in the reference to the bowel rumbling brilliance. And there's the bees in there are doing an awful lot of work, and actually, you know, the reverberation from that phrase is quite similar to the timpani itself. And the other thing that struck me, so it sort of talks about its lineage in terms of, you know, classical music through into pop music, because it has a life after this, even to the point it talks about John Bonham using an electronic version of a timpani and playing for Led Zeppelin, which is not something I'm aware of. However, it does say that the timpani is elemental and huge and sounds like it could crush you. And I think that's why when I first heard this song as a, you know, sort of mid-late teenager, especially having listened to a lot of other songs on this album, it just felt like a breath of fresh air and something of monumental importance. Until then, you listen to the rest of the song and realise it hadn't been worked through to its fullest conclusion. And at that point, I felt like I wanted more timpani, because it's actually quite sparingly used on this. Now, however, as a slightly older human being with one or two more grey hairs, I actually like the fact that it's been used so sparingly, that it punctuates rather than actually acts as something that runs all the way through. I think it makes it much more effective.
Well, it's a hook. I think it's as simple as that. It's one of the hooks of the song. But I think it's also one of the things that mitigates against that reading of this as sort of prefiguring what's to come, because it's actually very old-fashioned. It's very straightforwardly Roy Orbison, you know. That's kind of where your classic big timpani comes from in the 50s, and it's playing into that kind of thing, you know. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I think we know obviously that they were fans of Roy Orbison. He toured with Roy Orbison, etc., etc. So there's no question of the direct connection there. But I think it is a question, or I think it is a case of them being able to take something from an artist that they admire, apply it to their own songs, and while still sounding like a reference, it doesn't really sound derivative. It's not being used in quite the same way that it would be used in a Roy Orbison song. It is adding drama, which is, of course, the whole thing of Roy Orbison, is these big kind of melodramatic numbers. But this song isn't playing into it. It is adding that extra emotional depth to it. But this isn't a song which is playing melodrama up to the highlight. You know, it's essentially a love song. Kind of sounds a bit like the protagonist is trying to convince themselves at certain moments, but it is still basically a love song. It's not one of Roy Orbison's kind of big, oh, I'm so lonely, I'm so blue kind of numbers. But that it feels like it's harking back to that era. And it's very different from the song that we covered in the last episode, which is just a straightforward cover version of Carl Perkins. So if you compare the two, I think it's interesting to draw that comparison, because the straightforward cover version is just replication. There's nothing done with it. There's no attempt to kind of zhuzh it up or give it an extra whatever. It simply exists as a thing. Whereas this isn't simply replication of something that would happen in, for example, a Roy Orbison song, but it is drawing on almost like a sort of folk memory of what Roy Orbison's song is, and then applying that to a song which is indisputably a Beatles song. This doesn't sound like a Roy Orbison number. It sounds like a Beatles song, but it has that kind of underpinning which has been taken from their memory of other songs, and I really like that about this song. I like the fact that it's pulling on influences without simply replicating them.
And I think that's an important point to make, isn't it? Because all of their covers are pretty faithful. Most of the covers are pretty faithful. So to be able to take the influence and adapt it is a sign of their evolving craft. I realised just how serious and pretentious that sounded for a moment, halfway through saying it. Yeah, and I think doing a few different things, whether that's because they decided to, or whether because they were open to the influence of George Martin, doesn't really matter. I mean, they were open to influences like that in a way that perhaps other artists weren't, or other producers weren't as smart as to see the importance of those influences. And I would add that, I've made reference to the fact that the verse is a bit bland, except without the bit. Oh, I'm a lucky guy. Ooh. But actually, it's the piano that comes in partway through that gives it a bit of oomph. Now, again, if that's a McCartney thing, don't know. If it's George Martin deciding that that's it and the arrangement they want, brilliant. But it really works, and it really adds something that has a little bit of drive that is missing elsewhere. And I think as a sign as well of what they could have done with the song if they had decided to be a bit braver and think of it as being a potential single release.
Yeah, I agree. And the idea that this song has space where it could be pushed further, I think, is one of the things that makes it such an intriguing part of their back catalogue. Because, I mean, certainly in this form, it's not up to being a single. That's pretty clear, I would say. But I think the idea that there's space for more work to be done on it it feels like one of those rare paths not taken. I mean, we get so used to talking about everything that the Beatles did and everything that they achieved and how monumental, blah, blah, blah. But it's not often that we stop and think, well, what if they'd actually done something more with something? And this is one of the few examples. I think it's the Ian MacDonald book where he says if they'd included like a middle eight or something like that, it would have kind of diluted the power of the song. But I honestly don't agree with that at all. I think if you found the right one, it would give it somewhere to go. Part of the problem is that because the lyrics are relatively straightforward, there's not much in terms of development, but having the extra space for a well-written middle eight would give you something, not necessarily a catharsis, but it would give the lyrics somewhere to go. Maybe the slight, I'm trying to convince myself feel to the song might be something that could be expanded on. Again, that's not something that we get a lot of from the Beatles, but it would be another sort of fruitful area for them to develop in. So yeah, I would love to hear a version of this song that was just pushed a little bit harder, a little bit further. I really understand why they didn't want to do this at that point in their careers, but it's not often that we talk about those kind of roads not taken. But there are few songs where that might be more applicable to than this.
I mean, there are nice touches. I think the way in which the vocals drift out towards the end, with that focus on every little thing, is pretty sweet actually. And yet I think when the song starts, it doesn't feel like it's going to go anywhere at all. So yeah, missed opportunity, and that's perfectly fine, because they're the Beatles. What do you make of the fact it's supposedly written by Paul, but then of course we know it's sung by John? That's a bit of a rarity.
It is a bit of a rarity. I like it. I think it's interesting, and I think it pushes the performance in, again, directions that we don't normally get to see from Lennon at this stage. I think if there is a case to be made that there is any prefiguring in this song, it might be in Lennon's vocal, because it is starting to sound much more like the kind of, well, we'll do the whole Faux Dylan conversation when we get there, but the kind of Faux Dylan stuff on Help and Rubber Soul. And I think it's starting to suggest to Lennon, that there are things he can do that aren't just standing there and singing. So having him sing something which has been written maybe in an emotional register, or if that's not too pretentious a way of putting it, that maybe he wouldn't necessarily have chosen for himself, and particularly because there's a tension between the lyric, which is, I'm so lucky, I've got this girl, I'll never leave her, blah blah blah, and the music, which is, it's a very simple song. There's only half a dozen chords in it, but it's kind of minory. It's a wee bit. I know, yeah, it's got that tension. I'm saying minor. There's only one minor chord in it, which is B minor. Everything else is A, D, E, and G. But it's got a real tension set up between the way the lyric is trying to deliver something relatively upbeat and this strange, slightly odd time signature as well on the downbeat. And I think that really inspires Lennon to produce a great vocal performance. I think this is a really, really good performance from him. And also, I mean, not just in the technical sense, but just because it's pushing him out of the other stuff that he's doing on the album. It's not just a straightforward rock and roll number. It's not, it's not stand there and sing. So I love it. I really, really like the fact that it's Lennon singing a McCartney vocal. What do you reckon?
Well, I think he sings it pretty well. And if anyone has managed to get through some of our episodes, they'll know that I'm not always the biggest fan of Lennon's singing. I don't see the Dylan comparison even in a formative stage at the moment, but that's fine. I think I think it suits him because there is range, but the range isn't too vast. He's able to put a little bit of emotion in, and I think it probably suits some of his mentality. You could be mistaken for thinking it is a John Lennon lyric, especially in these early years, because there is that sense of, oh, I'm lucky that this nice person really, really likes me. There's that element to it, that almost self-pitying, almost creeping into, well, why shouldn't she? She's a woman and I'm a man kind of thing. But I think it works. I don't really, I can't really see Paul singing this, and I'm not quite sure he's got that at this stage, that emotional heft, because Paul's range is the kind of really kind of pleasant stuff, but also the screamer type thing at this stage, and there's not a huge amount that seems to go in between, although no doubt that will be hugely controversial with one person at some point, but we'll see. I mean, it's such a nice, refreshing change from some of the songs that have gone before, bearing in mind that we've had to plough through Moonlight, That Shall Never Be Spoken of Again, and Honey Don't. And it does make you wonder whether its positioning on the album makes it feel like it's greater than the sum of its parts. However, that's assuming that people these days are listening to it as a continuous run in an album rather than as an individual song. It'd be interesting to know from listeners how they do listen to the Beatles these days. Does anyone listen to anything as an album anymore, except other than on vinyl? And why would you listen to it on vinyl? You have to get up every 15-20 minutes and change the side. God, it's a pain.
Yes. Given our vinyl confessions in our previous episode, I'm not sure either of us are in the best place to make that as a criticism, but glossing over that. And the other thing I want to say about Lennon's vocal is that I don't exactly know that this is the right adjective for it, but I'm going to go for it anyway, which is that there's a slight fragility to it. And this was brought home by the fact that, as oft we do on this podcast, I've tried to investigate some cover versions. And one of the
is this where the swearing comes in?
This is definitely where the swearing is coming in. Yes. So one of the cover versions that I came across is by Yes, and it is fucking terrible. And no, I mean it's Yes, of course it's fucking terrible. So sorry to our Yes prog rock fans out there, but
can I just ask? My assumption is that because it's by Yes, not only is it terrible, but it's also 15 minutes long.
Well, that's well, it's funny you should say that. It's not. It's slightly under 6 minutes long. But this song is 2 minutes long, so they've tripled its length. So it is still falling within that, that kind of boundary. But it is, it's so fucking bad. I love doing this podcast, but every so often you would come across something you just think it's the worst thing ever, and fuck me, this is one of them. It's so bad. It takes what is, okay, fair enough. We've admitted that this is a relatively slight song in terms of its length, and it's maybe not the most sophisticated lyric in the world, but it's got its charms, and the charms here are quite delicate. And that's why I was hesitating around using the word fragility to describe Lennon's vocal. It's not quite fragile. It's not exactly the right word, but there is a delicateness to it.
I think there's a yearning.
A yearning, that's for sure. Well, it is fucking demolished by Yes. It's this massive kind of pylon of technically proficient slop that just drowns the song in its infancy. It's so bad. I think it takes them something like 2 minutes before they manage to stagger their way to bother with a fucking lyric. By the time it does get there, it's you've lost the will to live. It does that thing that just gets on my tits to a degree that I cannot begin to explain, which is for some reason just before the lyric comes in, it has they do the Day Tripper riff. It's right, okay. And like that first 2 minute block of music has nothing in common with the actual song. It's incredibly jarring when it shifts from 2 minutes of basically just a fucking wall of sound, but not wall of sound kind of production that just smears every fucking instrument in the world on it. Then they play the Day Tripper riff for no readily apparent reason. Then the song starts. It's just, I don't want to recommend it, but if you do go and listen to it, it's one of the most misjudged things I think I've ever fucking heard in my life. Anyway, right, that's it. I've stopped swearing now and I've stopped talking about this fucking cover version.
He's into microphone and says, it's a good job I didn't mention the dirty knife. Okay.
Well, exactly.
So while you were on that rant, I was listening, I promise. I was just trying to see if I could work out, because I had that memory that in one episode, and I cannot remember which song it was, I referred to a Grateful Dead cover of a Beatles song, or of a song that the Beatles had also covered. I can't find it now, and it's the same sort of thing that they ended up doing a 9-minute version of a 2-minute song, and you just think, who on earth are you? But it turns out that the Grateful Dead have actually covered quite a few Beatles songs. So we have the joy of talking about Grateful Dead covers of Blackbird, Day Tripper, Dear Prudence, Hey Jude, It's All Too Much, Lucy in Sky with Diamonds, Rain, Revolution, Tomorrow Never Knows, and Why Don't We Do It in the Road. Dum, 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 dum. So, thanks for that. That's that's going to be something.
Look, if nothing else, I've fleshed out the running time of the episode, so.
Which is interesting, because normally we don't have a problem with waffling on, and but I think it's kind of interesting that these are songs that this is a song that we like, but the fact that there isn't a huge amount to talk about on it is an indication of what the Beatles did with it as well. So it's good. It's relatively slight. We can make the comparisons to other Beatles tracks, and we could sort of say, wouldn't it be nice if? Can we look forward to this, that, or the other? But at the end of the day, it's a nice 2-minute song.
I concur, and I don't really have anything to add beyond that.
Yeah, but that's a good thing. That's actually not a bad thing at all.
Okay.
So
then.
sometimes you shouldn't drag things out and just say, let's see, what can I say? Let's go for 6.
6?
No. Yeah, well, no, that's about right. See, I can't give it a 7. Maybe I have to downgrade Honey Don't from the last episode to a 4. But I think 6 out of 10 is fair. Bearing in mind, if they'd have spent a little bit longer on the production, I think it would have scored a lot higher.
I'm going to be fractionally more generous than that, but the fraction is half. So I'm going to go for a 6.5 on that one. I think. Yeah, I agree. I do. It is. It's a funny little song. I listened to it a few days ago just to make sure I had it rattling around in my head for a while before we started to record, and it has kind of stayed there. It's kind of got stuck. It's a funny song, but yeah, I'm going to give it 6.5.
Just for a little bit of a reference, just going on setlist.fm, and obviously this refers to live shows, but the band that Yes have played most often, it could just be one song that they've included in the most gigs, Simon and Garfunkel.
Really?
Which I think is quite interesting. And Buffalo Springfield come out higher than the Beatles. However, I am going to point out the fact that if you keep scrolling far enough, you get to Rolf Harris. But Rolf Harris beats Buggles. Anyway, before you go into the I was about to say, have I got news for you? Section, but what do we call it? The section on
you can really get a hold of us.
That's it. You can really. Oh, that was the other song I was thinking of. That is an uplift. I know it's a cover, but it's an uplifting side to Beatles track that really really works. Just before we get on to praising our own work, I just want to mention I've been listening to the Big Beatles Sort Out as they start their new series, and they're working on the Big 60s Sort Out, where they are taking all of the number ones from the 1960s in turn. Of course, that will include talking about Beatles tracks. I think it would be very interesting for them, because I suspect, and I actually hope, that they will recognise the fact, although there are no greater bands than the Beatles, there are bands who have produced singles that are potentially greater than the singles released by the Beatles. And I think it'd be an interesting thing to see where perhaps they rate, I don't know, Good Vibrations in relation to the Beatles singles, for example. Whereas, I think the Beach Boys shone brightly for a short period of time, and an awful lot of their back catalogue is just dire. Some of the things when they were really good are just the most amazing pieces of music that have ever been recorded. So that would be interesting. But I was reminded of that because I want to give a big Beatles shout out to my podcast host, Mr. J.G. McQuarrie, because as good and as interesting as the first few episodes have been of the Big 60s Sort Out, I think if you go onto JG's blog, and he'll give you the address for that in a minute, you will find where he's pulled together writing from a series that he did looking at rating the best number twos in UK chart history. And it was very much focused solely on the songs that peaked at number 2, which is a fascinating look, and then selecting which one was the best in each year going forward. And I suppose if anyone does listen to both this and the Big 60s Sort Out, then what you could do is go back and have a look at the ones that JG picked for that particular year, and have a think about whether or not it's always the best song that gets to number 2, or whether some of those that got to number 2 would have been better, perhaps in our view, than the number ones. So over to you, JG. I've plugged your blog. I would highly recommend that you, dear listener, go and have a look. And where can they find it?
Well, they can find it at www.jgmcquarrie.scot, and thank you for those kind words. It was a really, really fascinating series to write. I should say one thing. It's not just UK chart history, so it's either UK or US. But that's simply because there are some years where there was nothing worth talking about, so it helped develop a little bit of diversity in terms of the material that could be covered. But it was a really fascinating series to write, and it's kind of interesting to have a look at the songs that kind of almost make it, but not quite. Now, inevitably, there's one massive, great Beatles connection there. You can probably guess which one, but it was kind of interesting to look into that, because there were a couple of facts around it that I wasn't aware of, despite the fact that I like to think of myself as being sort of relatively well informed on the subject of the Beatles. So it kind of threw up a few bits and pieces that I just didn't know. We'll talk about that maybe more when we get to the why am I pretending it's not Strawberry Fields Forever? Of course it bloody is.
I think we'll get to that in about 2027.
Yes, I think so. So it'll be a while, but we will get there in the end. And yeah, it was a really great series. I also just want to I really enjoy Big Beatles Sort Out. It's one of the best Beatles podcasts out there. So I'm really interested. I haven't started listening to the Big 60 Sort Out yet, but I will do soon.
It's
lovely.
It's the
Yeah. Excellent. Good. Right. Let us call it there. Well, you can really... I nearly did the Have I Got News For You theme tune there now as well. You see, I've got that stuck in my head. You can really get a hold of us. You can contact us by email. We are BeatlesStuffology@gmail.com. We're on Twitter @Beatles_ology, and we're Beatles Stuffology on Instagram. As previously mentioned, you can find my blog at www.jgmcquarrie.scot. And please check out my other podcast, which is Talking Trek to You, where a noob and an expert go through the original Star Trek series episode by episode. Please like, rate, and review us on whatever podcatcher you're using so that more people can find the show. The more you rate us, the more people have to listen to our inane waffling. And that just seems like a good thing all round. Lovely. Next week, I don't want to spoil the party, but we have to listen to that song, so I'm probably going to. But until then, keep listening.